Welcome to Dead Quiet Mysteries, the place where every cold case, chilling crime, and unsolved mystery is brought back to life. From vanished persons to twisted betrayals, we dig deep into the unknown to uncover the truth that others left buried. Before we begin, drop a comment and tell us which city and country you're watching from. We love seeing how far the mystery travels. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button and ring the bell icon so you never miss a case. Because here, some truths are only heard in the dead quiet. Hercule Poirot and What the Garden Hid. Chapter 1. The Invitation. It was a dull and breezy Thursday morning when Hercule Poirot, retired but never idle, sat before the breakfast tray in his flat on Whitehaven Mansions. The toast was precisely browned, the coffee aromatic, and the newspaper folded to just the right angle. Nothing, it seemed, was out of place. Nothing except for the envelope. It had arrived an hour earlier, carried by the post and placed carefully upon his side table by his valet George. The envelope was cream, thick with texture, and bore a distinct scent of lavender and ink. The handwriting on the front, curvaceous, dramatic, was instantly familiar to him. "Ah," said Poirot softly, tilting his head, "from la grande dame herself." He slit the envelope with surgical care and withdrew the note inside. The paper was embossed with the crest of Bramble Cottage, a place he had not heard mentioned in over 10 years. He read, "My dearest Monsieur Poirot, if this reaches you, I hope it finds you in good health and, dare I say, some measure of boredom. Bramble Cottage is rather changed since you last visited, but my spirit remains unaltered. I am hosting a weekend of company, and I should very much like you to be among my guests. It is perhaps not the sort of gathering that would draw you by name alone, but I suspect you would find it interesting. Do come, there are things I wish to discuss. Affectionately yours, Clarissa Wynter." Poirot sat back and twirled the letter once between his fingers, deep in thought. Clarissa Wynter, actress, socialite, and a woman with a talent for performance both on and off the stage, had once dazzled the London theatres with her sharp voice and sharper wit. He remembered her from a certain case involving a lost emerald and a misplaced understudy. And now she was writing again. The tone of her letter, for all its theatrical air, carried a subtle note beneath the flourish, something whispered and urgent. Poirot's eyes narrowed ever so slightly. George appeared in the doorway, silent as ever. "George," said Poirot, "do pack a weekend bag. We are going to Kent." Bramble Cottage stood just outside the village of Marlingford, a place the guidebooks called quaint and the locals called quiet. It was late October, and the country roads wound through skeletal trees, shedding their last golden leaves like sighs on the wind. The cottage emerged at the end of a gravel drive, its roof thatched, and its walls shrouded in ivy turned deep red with the season. The taxi came to a slow halt, and Poirot stepped out into the crisp autumn air, brushing a fleck of dust from the sleeve of his tailored coat. A soft fog was creeping across the garden, and overhead a blackbird shrieked into the hush of afternoon. The door was opened not by Clarissa, but by a woman of 35 or so, with neatly combed dark hair, high cheekbones, and a gaze as unreadable as a closed curtain. "You must be Monsieur Poirot. I'm Eleanor Voss, Miss Wynter's companion. She's expecting you. Please, come in." The interior of the house was elegant in a theatrical way, velvet drapes, an oil painting of Clarissa in her stage costume above the hearth, and a faint scent of violets that seemed permanent rather than sprayed. Clarissa herself emerged moments later, gliding into the drawing room like a duchess entering stage left. "My dear Poirot," she exclaimed, arms outstretched, "you haven't aged a day, or perhaps you simply aged so well at 40 that time has decided to leave you be." "And you, Madame Wynter," Poirot replied, bowing slightly, "are still capable of entrances that silence rooms." She laughed, a rich and musical sound, and kissed him lightly on both cheeks. "Come, sit. There's tea, of course, and people you must meet." She led him into the drawing room, where the other guests had begun to assemble. Clarissa moved between them with the ease of a practiced hostess. "This is my niece, Marianne Wynter," Clarissa said, gesturing toward a pale young woman with auburn hair, dressed plainly but neatly. "She has recently returned from Rome, haven't you, darling?" Marianne gave Poirot a nod, her expression polite but guarded. "And here we have Dr. Basil Trent, botanist and herbalist of alarming conviction." Dr. Trent was a thin, twitchy man with spectacles too large for his face and fingers stained faintly green. "Plants are more honest than people, Monsieur Poirot," he said abruptly. "They either thrive or die, no pretending." Poirot offered a courteous smile, an admirable clarity of principle. Clarissa turned to the final guest. "And this is Julian Roque, a writer, or so he tells me. He is working on a most fascinating treatise about memory and the theatre." Julian Roque was young, perhaps no more than 28, with golden curls and a scarf knotted artfully at his throat. He rose to shake Poirot's hand with enthusiasm. "I've heard of you, of course," he said. "You're quite the legend. I must confess, when Miss Wynter said she was inviting you, I thought it might be a performance." "Rest assured," Poirot replied smoothly. "I am seldom invited for entertainment purposes." That earned a chuckle from Clarissa, though Marianne seemed less amused. The conversation turned to weather, travel, and theatre. As tea was served, Poirot observed with a quiet eye. Marianne rarely looked up from her cup. Eleanor Voss kept a hand resting near Clarissa's shoulder, as if protecting her from the air itself. Julian flitted from topic to topic, charming and evasive, while Dr. Trent muttered botanical facts under his breath whenever someone mentioned flowers. Poirot leaned back, watching the faces, the gestures, the silences. He did not yet know what Clarissa Wynter feared, or why she had summoned him here. But as he watched her pour tea with her graceful, aging hands, he thought he caught the faintest tremor in her fingers. And when she met his eyes across the room, her smile was warm, but her eyes did not smile at all. Chapter 2. A House of Echoes. The wind whistled down the chimney that evening as if rehearsing a lament, and Bramble Cottage, for all its charm, seemed suddenly a little too large, a little too still. The fire crackled in the drawing-room, throwing long shadows against the oak-panelled walls. Poirot, freshly bathed and perfectly dressed in his grey wool suit with a silk cravat, had taken his seat beside the fire. Clarissa Wynter, too, sat close, though she looked distracted, her gaze hovering on some invisible point just past the edge of the hearthrug. The others filtered in slowly after dinner, each with a drink in hand. Eleanor Voss had excused herself for a brief phone call, while Marianne returned with a book she did not open. Dr. Trent had brought with him a basket of dried leaves and was gently sorting through them with evident devotion. Julian Roque, meanwhile, sprawled on the divan and tapped absently at the side of his glass. "It's funny, isn't it?" Julian said, addressing the ceiling. "How this place hums. Most houses creak or sigh. This one, it hums like it remembers things." Poirot raised a brow. "The house, monsieur, or the people within it?" Julian grinned, but did not answer. Eleanor returned then, her heels silent on the thick rug. She took her place beside Clarissa, her hand brushing lightly against the older woman's arm as she sat. Clarissa stirred. "You all make the place sound haunted. I assure you it is not." "Not haunted, perhaps," said Dr. Trent, "but it has age, and age remembers." "More wine?" Marianne asked, already pouring herself a second glass. Her voice was flat, her smile brief and closed. Poirot noticed a shift in Clarissa's posture. She was watching her niece, not with affection, nor with concern, but with something closer to calculation. Not dislike exactly, but distance. Poirot had seen that look before, on stage, between actresses waiting for a cue, their rivalry playing out in silent glances. He took a sip of his tisane and let the others talk. Later, as the hour grew late and yawns were politely stifled, Clarissa rose. "Well, darlings, I fear I am not as tireless as I once was. I shall retire." She touched Poirot's shoulder lightly. "May I speak with you briefly in the morning?" "But of course, madame." "Good. There's something I wish to show you." She left the room, Eleanor following without a word. The rest of the guests broke apart slowly after that. Dr. Trent disappeared into the study with his leaves. Marianne took her book and vanished down the hallway. Julian lingered just long enough to extinguish the fire, humming a little tune Poirot did not recognize. And then there was silence. Poirot made his way upstairs. His guest room, though small, was warm and tastefully decorated. A water jug, a single rose in a vase, and a copy of the Times waited on the writing desk. He unpacked precisely, placed his slippers by the bed, and stepped to the window. The moon was waning behind a cloud, but the garden below glimmered faintly with dew. He could just make out the edge of the fig tree, where a wrought-iron bench sat beneath curled leaves. All was calm. And then, soft, almost spectral, a sound, a cry. Poirot turned his head sharply. It was not a scream of terror nor a cry of pain. It was shorter, clipped. Perhaps a woman's voice, perhaps an owl. But it had risen just once and did not return. He waited, counted to 30. No footsteps, no movement, only the wind. Poirot did not sleep immediately. Instead, he lay in bed, hands clasped across his chest, mind working gently but insistently. Something was stirring at Bramble Cottage. Something Clarissa Wynter had suspected or feared. And if Poirot had learned anything in his career, it was that people did not write to him without reason, not unless they wished something to be found. The next morning dawned clear, bright, and golden. The October sun cast dancing patterns of light through the leaves, and Bramble Cottage looked innocent again, as if it had never heard a whisper. Poirot descended to breakfast just after 8, his moustaches perfectly waxed, his gait unhurried. George was not with him on this trip. Clarissa had insisted he come alone, but his valet had packed his affairs so well that Poirot felt himself no less prepared. In the breakfast room, a large table was laid with boiled eggs, warm bread, soft cheese, and a silver coffee urn that steamed invitingly. Eleanor Voss was already there, seated at the far end, spreading marmalade onto toast with meticulous precision. "Good morning, Monsieur Poirot," she said, without looking up. "Bonjour, mademoiselle," he replied. "It is a day full of sun and secrets, I think." She gave a tight smile. "Everything is always more dramatic when you're here." Poirot poured his coffee and took his seat. "Where is Madame Wynter? I was to see her this morning." Eleanor hesitated. "She didn't come down yet, but I dare say she might have overslept. She had a poor night." "Ah," said Poirot gently. "As did I." "There was a curious sound in the night. Did you hear it?" Eleanor paused for a fraction of a second. Then calmly, "No. I sleep deeply." Poirot nodded, filing her answer away. Julian and Dr. Trent entered together shortly after, the latter already muttering about seeds and soil. Marianne came in last, her hair loosely tied, her eyes bloodshot. "Bad dreams?" Julian asked her. She ignored him and reached for the coffee. They were halfway through breakfast when Eleanor rose suddenly. "Excuse me," she said. "Clarissa really should be down by now." She left. Silence fell. Poirot stirred his coffee but did not drink it. He stared, unblinking, at the sun-dappled window. Minutes later, a sound came from above, a hurried footstep, a stifled cry. Eleanor's voice. Poirot was on his feet before she could call his name again. The others followed him up the staircase, a strange, silent procession. Eleanor stood just outside Clarissa Wynter's bedroom, her hand to her mouth, her eyes wide. Poirot stepped past her and into the room. Clarissa was seated by the window in her dressing gown, her head gently tilted to one side, a book in her lap. The breeze ruffled the edge of the curtain. Poirot stepped forward. The book fell from her hands and hit the floor with a soft thud. Clarissa Wynter was dead. Chapter 3. A death in the garden. The autumn sunlight, so bright only minutes before, seemed to dull as the news spread through Bramble Cottage like smoke. Clarissa Wynter, vivacious, imperious Clarissa, was dead. Dr. Bertram Willows arrived from the village at a little past 10. A kindly man in his late 60s, with a soft voice and tobacco-stained fingers, he had known Clarissa for 20 years. He emerged from the bedroom after 20 minutes and gave his verdict with a solemn shake of the head. "Peaceful heart failure," he murmured. "I believe she passed sometime in the early hours, likely while reading by the window." He looked over at Poirot. "No signs of struggle, no trauma, no cause for suspicion. The heart simply gives out, Monsieur Poirot. It is, in the end, the body's way of surrendering." Poirot inclined his head. "Mais oui, doctor, but surrender does not always come without invitation." The remark was gently made, but Dr. Willows looked puzzled. Poirot excused himself and entered the room once more. Clarissa Wynter's body had been respectfully covered with a blanket. A faint scent of rose water still lingered in the air. The window beside her had been opened slightly, letting in a drifting breeze. Poirot moved to the book that had fallen from her lap and bent to retrieve it. It was a slim volume of poetry by Christina Rossetti. The title, A Pageant and Other Poems. He thumbed through the pages, stopping at the one that had been open when it fell. The edge was torn, as though something had been hastily removed. A note? A letter? He made no remark, but placed the book carefully on the bedside table. From the window one could see the garden, Clarissa's pride, Poirot recalled. It had always been an untamed beauty, dotted with rare plants and trees allowed to grow naturally, rather than trimmed into submission. At the centre stood her beloved fig tree, its branches now half bare, trembling in the breeze. Poirot's gaze drifted lower. Clarissa's slippers, neatly arranged, stood by the wardrobe. But the shoes she wore last, simple black flats, were still on her feet. The soles were damp and marked with flecks of soil. "Curious," Poirot murmured. Clarissa had been found by the window in her dressing gown, yet her shoes bore the signs of garden soil, and it had not rained since the previous afternoon. Where had she been walking? He descended the stairs and found Eleanor Voss in the kitchen, speaking in hushed tones with the housekeeper, Mrs. Priwet. Eleanor's face was pale, but her composure had returned. "Monsieur Poirot," she said, "Dr. Willows has notified the registrar. He believes there's no need for an inquest." You don't agree?" Poirot stepped closer, his voice low. "Mademoiselle, I do not wish to cause alarm, but your employer wrote to me last week with a most curious tone. She requested my presence, and not merely for companionship. Did she speak to you of this letter?" Eleanor hesitated. She didn't mention writing to you, but Clarissa was unsettled lately. She said odd things, that she felt watched, that people had grown hungry around her." Said Poirot, "a dramatic phrase." "She was a dramatic woman." "Indeed. And last night?" "We parted around 10:30, Eleanor said. She retired to her room. I heard no disturbance, nothing unusual. No sound at all. Well," she hesitated again. "I thought I heard her moving about just before midnight. I assumed she was looking for a warmer shawl or something of the sort. The nights are cold now." Poirot nodded and excused himself. He found Julian Roque in the garden, seated on the stone bench beneath the fig tree, sketching something into a small notebook. "She's really gone," Julian said without looking up. "I didn't think she ever would. She was like, what's the word, a monument." Poirot sat beside him. "It is a difficult thing, Monsieur Roque, to lose someone unexpectedly." Julian turned a page. "I only met her a month ago, through a friend in theatre. I barely knew her. But she invited me, said I had a poet's face and a criminal's brain, which I think was a compliment. We got on. And yet you sketch in the garden, not with the others. I think better here." He glanced up. "Are you suspecting something?" "I suspect," said Poirot, "that the truth is seldom content to remain buried." Julian smirked. "Cryptic, but then again, that's your reputation, isn't it?" Poirot left him there and returned to the drawing room where Marianne stood by the fireplace, arms folded. "She didn't die naturally," she said abruptly before Poirot could speak. "Why do you say so, Mademoiselle Wynter?" "Because Clarissa never did anything peacefully. She flung open doors, she wept over jam tarts, she screamed at the radio. Even sleep was dramatic with her. The idea that she just drifted off quietly." She shook her head. "It doesn't fit." Poirot observed her with interest. "And yet, you had not spoken in some time, n'est-ce pas?" "We had our differences," she admitted. "She resented me for my choices, and I resented her for resenting me. But I didn't want her dead." "May I ask what kept you apart?" Marianne looked down. "A man. Years ago. One she adored, one I refused to adore. That sort of thing leaves marks in a Wynter household." Poirot inclined his head. "Thank you." Later that afternoon, Poirot wandered the garden. Autumn leaves swirled about his feet. He passed a patch of rare herbs that Clarissa had once boasted of, and beyond them a small bench where a pair of secateurs rested. He stopped near the fig tree and studied the soil. Beneath its roots were faint indentations, as though someone had stood there for a time. Poirot crouched, brushing aside a leaf, and found a flattened ribbon of white, torn, damp, and lightly smeared with something yellow. He held it between his fingers. Then, as the light began to dim, Poirot looked once more at the house, its walls dappled with the last of the sun. Something had happened in the garden. Something that Clarissa had taken with her into death. But the garden, like all things touched by Clarissa Wynter, had refused to remain silent. Chapter 4. The leaves lie still. The leaves in Clarissa Wynter's garden no longer danced in the wind. They had settled now, pressed to the soil like forgotten notes. And so, too, had the household begun to settle, into mourning, into suspicion, and, unspoken though it was, into waiting. By late morning, Clarissa's body had been respectfully removed, and the local constable, a square-shouldered man named Sergeant Fenn, had declared there to be nothing to report, unless London said otherwise. Yet Poirot remained, not because he doubted the villagers' conclusions, though he did, but because Clarissa herself had asked him to stay. He began, as always, not with accusations, but with listening. Interview I. Marianne. Wynter. Poirot found Clarissa's niece in the conservatory, seated cross-legged in the sun with a cigarette and a half-drunk cup of tea. "You don't believe she died naturally, do you?" she asked, without turning. Poirot stepped inside, hands clasped neatly behind him. "Let us say only this, mademoiselle. I believe in the contradictions of quiet deaths." Marianne exhaled a slow ribbon of smoke. "She made enemies, you know, not obvious ones. Clarissa was too clever for that. But she had this talent for making people feel both adored and replaceable. Did she make you feel so?" "She tried," Marianne admitted. "We had our battles, but recently she reached out. Said she wanted to reconcile. I came." "Did she seem afraid?" Marianne paused. "Once. On the second night we were walking in the garden. She stopped near the fig tree and looked over her shoulder, like she heard something. When I asked what was wrong, she said, 'Some leaves fall quietly. Some scream all the way down.' A poetic woman. A frightened one, I think." Poirot noted the comment carefully. The fig tree again. Interview 2. Doctor. Basil Trent. The botanist was in the study, surrounded by leaves. He held a specimen up to the light, tweezers in hand. "Ah, Monsieur Poirot, forgive the mess. My work is the only tidy thing about me." "You are studying the flora of Clarissa's garden?" Dr. Trent brightened. "Indeed. She let me plant a rare tigridia last spring. Quite toxic in the right preparation, you know, but beautiful. I warned her, of course." Poirot sat. And yet I noticed the Tigridia patch is empty. Trent frowned. Is it? That's odd. I checked it 2 days ago. Have any samples gone missing? I keep nothing in the house, only pressed samples. But if someone wanted a toxin, he added, raising a brow, they needn't look far. Dozens of plants here could simulate cardiac arrest. Clarissa knew that. She read everything I gave her. Poirot tilted his head. She had interest in poisons? An academic one. She once joked about writing a murder mystery of her own. Let us hope it was not her own obituary, Poirot murmured. Interview 3. Julian Roque. Julian was reclining in the lounge, sprawled like a cat with a book of Molière, open but unread. She was a fascinating woman, he said. Too large for the village, too loud for peace. You knew her only briefly, n'est-ce pas? 2 months, Julian replied. I met her at a charity recital in Belgravia. I told her I was writing a book. She liked that, thought I had a shadowed look. He smiled faintly. She invited me for tea the next day. 1 week later, I was here. Poirot settled in beside him. What were you really writing, monsieur? Julian blinked. I told you, a book on memory and performance. Yet when I asked of Sarah Siddons, the actress Clarissa idolized, you called her he, a small slip, but one a true scholar of theatre would never make. Julian's face darkened. Poirot leaned closer. Let me guess. You met her through an acquaintance? You charmed her? Perhaps borrowed a bit too much money. She invited you here to see if you were worthy, or a fraud. Julian straightened. I didn't kill her, if that's what you're after. I never said you did, Poirot replied calmly. But your lies are clumsy. Be careful where they land. Interview 4. Eleanor Voss. Eleanor met him in the drawing room, her hands folded neatly, her expression unreadable. You've been questioning us all, she said. I take it you're no longer satisfied with heart failure? Poirot gave a modest shrug. It is not my habit to interfere, but I observe, and what I observe does not align. Eleanor said nothing. You were close to Madame Wynter. She trusted me. And she recently made changes to her will. You were removed, were you not? Eleanor's eyes narrowed. Who told you that? Poirot smiled. One hears things. She had, I believe, decided to leave the estate to a conservatory in Bath. It must have felt like betrayal. Eleanor's lips thinned. She'd been manipulated by Marianne, by that ridiculous boy. She lost her judgment. Ah, but did she lose her life before or after she changed the will? There was a long silence. Poirot rose. One more thing. Do you recognize this? He drew from his pocket the torn ribbon he had found in the garden. White silk, smeared with a faint yellow stain. Eleanor hesitated, then shook her head. I've never seen it. But Poirot saw it, just for a second, in her eyes, that flicker of surprise, of fear, swiftly buried. Later that afternoon, Poirot returned to the garden. The air had turned sharp with the promise of rain, and the shadows were growing longer. He walked slowly to the fig tree. There, buried just beneath the soil near the roots, he found a small indentation, the size and shape of a heel. Another followed nearby. Someone had stood here for a time, perhaps even watched. A faint trail of crushed leaves led back toward the house. Poirot bent, plucked a brittle petal from the ground, and brought it to his nose. The smell was faint, sweet, acidic, familiar. He returned inside, his mind stirring. Clarissa had walked the garden late at night. She had returned with soil on her shoes, her book torn, her gloves missing, and the ribbon. All around her, guests with secrets. All around her, the falling of quiet leaves. Chapter 5. Shadows and Signatures. The village solicitor, Mr. Horace Phelps, was a man who wore spectacles too large for his face and a moustache too small for his dignity. He met Poirot in his dusty office above the ironmonger's shop in Marlingford that same afternoon, after receiving a discreet telegram from the detective requesting a confidential consultation. Yes, yes, Phelps said, flipping through a large folder marked Wynter, Clarissa, Personal. She did amend her will, quite recently in fact, 2 weeks ago, on the dot. Ah, Poirot said mildly. A woman of precision. Indeed, the prior version left the bulk of her estate to her niece, Miss Marianne Wynter, with modest legacies to her companion, Miss Voss, and 2 charities. And the revised version? A considerable shift. Nearly the entirety of the estate was redirected to the Bath Conservatory of Dramatic Arts, with token sums, very token mind you, left to the niece and to Mr. Julian Roke, whom she had only just met. And Miss Voss. Removed entirely, Phelps said with a sigh. She signed a codicil last month removing Miss Voss from any inheritance, citing a matter of character and conduct. Rather damning, though I was never told the specifics. Was Miss Voss aware of this change? I believe so, though Miss Wynter had planned to tell her formally this weekend. She had even scheduled a private conversation with me for Sunday morning. Sadly, she did not live to see it. Poirot sat back, fingertips pressed together. And this revised will... It has been safely filed. Yes, with my clerk, signed, witnessed, and sealed. I dare say there will be some surprise among the parties. Poirot gave a slow nod. I do not think surprise is the word, monsieur. Perhaps. Motive. Back at Bramble Cottage, the atmosphere had changed. The rooms were too quiet. Conversation stopped when Poirot entered. Even the light seemed more brittle, as though the house had become aware of its own secrets. He retired to Clarissa's study that evening, under the pretext of reading, and with the tacit approval of Eleanor Voss, who, curiously, no longer objected to his presence anywhere in the house. The study was Clarissa's private domain, elegant, refined, theatrical. A collection of opera scores lined the walls, interspersed with fading portraits of Clarissa in her youth. And on the desk, a slender music box. It was old, mother of pearl, inlaid with silver, its tune faintly audible as Poirot turned the key and let it chime. A sorrowful aria played, but something else caught his attention. A rattle. He turned it upside down and gently tapped the bottom. A panel slipped loose. Inside, nestled in the hidden compartment, was a folded letter, its corners curling, the ink slightly faded. Poirot unfolded it with care. Monsieur Poirot, forgive my sudden boldness. I would not summon you without cause, but something is amiss. I feel eyes on me when I am alone. Not the eyes of ghosts, real ones. I do not trust my house nor those in it. Someone has changed. I cannot say who, I cannot say why, but I sense the shift as one senses a draft in a closed room. You understand such things, I know. Come discreetly. Come soon. C.W. No date, no named suspect, only unease. Poirot replaced the panel, locked the box, and slipped the letter into his pocket. He had enough now to begin drawing lines between shadows. He returned downstairs and found Mrs. Priwet, the housekeeper, in the hall. Madame, he asked gently, do you know if Madame Wynter kept a diary? The old woman looked startled. Yes, in her nightstand drawer, sir. Wrote in it every evening like prayer. Private, that was. Why? Because it is no longer there. Later that night, Poirot stood alone by the fireplace in the drawing-room. The others had all gone to their rooms early, the mood in the house now one of barely veiled tension. The garden beyond the windows rustled under the moonlight, the trees swaying like witnesses afraid to speak. He turned to see Marianne Wynter step in, barefoot, holding a glass of wine. You're not sleeping either, she said. Poirot motioned to a chair. Come, let us talk. She sat. Her eyes were clearer now than they had been since Clarissa's death, less guarded, but no less alert. Your aunt planned to speak to you about the will, Poirot said. She had already changed it. I suspected that much, Marianne replied softly. She was going to cut me out completely. You are wrong, Poirot said gently. She restored you to it, A modest sum, yes, but enough to suggest reconciliation. Marianne blinked. She never said. She may not have had the chance. Marianne looked down. She said something strange to me the evening before she died. She said, "When you feel the curtain drop, don't trust the applause." I thought it was one of her usual lines, but now I'm not so sure. She meant, Poirot said, that someone was pretending. He stood and stepped to the sideboard where Clarissa's glove box still sat, untouched since her death. Inside, he found only one glove. The other, presumably, had been worn when she went into the garden and never returned. The next morning brought an unusual silence to Bramble Cottage. No one came down for breakfast except Eleanor Voss. She buttered a slice of toast with mechanical calm. Poirot sat across from her. "Mademoiselle," he said, "I must ask something most delicate." She did not look up. "You intend to accuse me now, don't you?" "Not yet," Poirot said calmly. "But I wonder if you had a letter from Clarissa that suggested she feared someone, and if you had removed pages from her diary, what would you expect me to conclude?" At last, Eleanor looked up. Her eyes were clear, her tone even. "I loved her, but I would not lie for her." "You have already lied once, Miss Voss," Poirot said gently. "You said you had never seen this." From his pocket, he withdrew the white ribbon from the garden, the one smeared with faint yellow pollen. Eleanor's breath caught. "It was from your gloves," Poirot said. "Gloves that are now missing." Still, she said nothing. "But perhaps," Poirot continued, "you were not the only one with cause to fear a change in fortune." He stood. "I ask only one more thing of you tonight. Join us in the garden tomorrow. At dawn. One more scene. One final curtain." That evening, Poirot prepared in silence. He sat by the window of his guest room, watching the trees bend under the weight of the wind. A killer was among them. That he knew. But the final leaf had not yet fallen. And when it did, it would land, like truth always does, exactly where it was meant to. Chapter 6. A Walk Through Memory. The morning came slowly to Bramble Cottage. A fine mist hung over the hedgerows, and the fig tree in the centre of the garden stood like a statue veiled in lace. The house itself was subdued, its silence no longer mourning, but waiting. For what? None of its occupants could quite say. At just past 8, Poirot stepped into the garden alone. The leaves crackled underfoot, russet, yellow and brittle with the frost of the previous night. He walked not aimlessly, but with the meticulous care of a man reviewing the steps of a dance once performed. Clarissa Wynter had been seen retiring to bed on Friday evening, shortly after 10. Yet she had not died in her bed. She had died by the window, shoes muddied, robe loosely tied. Something had drawn her back into the garden that night. Poirot began at the gravel path just beneath the kitchen window and followed it towards the fig tree, the path she might have taken. Near the trunk, he found what he had expected: a few flattened leaves, a slight depression in the soil, and a thin crescent-shaped mark, perhaps from the edge of a small heel. He paused there, glancing upward into the bare branches. A bird's nest. Empty now, long abandoned. But something else drew his eye. A faint glimmer, barely noticeable, tucked into the roots where soil met bark. Poirot crouched carefully. There, half buried beneath a cluster of damp leaves, lay a small glass vial, corked with a faded label. The word was smudged, but a single line remained legible. T. aurantiaca, extract 3x. He lifted it delicately with a handkerchief and turned it in his palm. Inside was only residue, a sticky golden smear along the interior. Tigridia aurantiaca, Dr. Trent's prized South American plant, rare, exquisite and, as the good doctor himself had so generously volunteered, lethal in extract when prepared correctly. Poirot turned his head slowly, as though expecting someone to emerge from the shadows. No one came. He placed the vial into a sealed pouch in his pocket and continued walking. At the edge of the garden, just before the orchard, he found another trace, a crushed cigarette with lipstick faintly visible on the filter. Nearby, a disturbed patch of soil, covered in fresh leaves. He crouched again, brushing gently. And there it was. A leather-bound journal, water-stained but intact, its edges dirtied, its pages fanned slightly apart from moisture. Clarissa's handwriting flowed in tight, elegant script. He flipped carefully towards the final pages. A few had been removed, torn deliberately. But one remained, still damp and legible. I saw her near the bench again tonight. She said she couldn't sleep, that I looked pale. I asked her to go back inside, but she lingered, watching me. There's a softness in her voice now, but it's the wrong kind. I feel rehearsed. Poirot closed the journal and stood, brushing off his trousers. He returned to the house just before 9 and requested a private word with Dr. Basil Trent in the study. Your tigridia extract, Poirot began. How potent is it in small quantities? Dr. Trent removed his spectacles and rubbed them on his sleeve. Highly. It mimics cardiac arrest, causes drowsiness, numbness, and eventually respiratory collapse. If administered in warm liquid, the symptoms appear as natural as old age. Why? Poirot gave a small, satisfied nod. No reason, doctor. Curiosity only. Later that morning, Poirot summoned Mrs. Edith Bromley, a neighbour and friend of Clarissa's, who had previously been mentioned only in passing. She arrived wrapped in a thick shawl, her round spectacles misted from the cold. I understand, Poirot said gently, that you sometimes walk past Bramble Cottage in the mornings. Oh yes, every day, she nodded. Clarissa used to wave to me from the kitchen window. Did you pass by on Saturday morning? I did, a bit earlier than usual, 6:30. I saw someone then out back, thought it odd. May I ask who? Mrs. Bromley hesitated. Looked like that young fellow, Mr. Roke, coming out the side door. He had something in his hand and he looked over his shoulder like he didn't want to be seen. Thought maybe he was just sneaking a cigarette. Poirot nodded. Thank you, that is most helpful. Poirot spent the remainder of the afternoon in the drawing room, sipping chocolate and observing. Julian paced. Eleanor polished silver she had already cleaned. Marianne read the same page of a book 3 times. Dr. Trent disappeared entirely. By the time dusk fell, Poirot had made his decision. At supper, he rose and addressed the household with quiet dignity. Mes amis, I will ask you to join me tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock sharp, in the garden. I wish to conduct a small experiment, a reenactment, if you will. One final performance in Madame Wynter's honour. There were puzzled glances, but no objections. Julian smiled with an edge of mockery. Will there be roles to play? Only yourselves, Poirot replied. But do be prompt. In murder, the late often remain forever so. That night, Poirot sat once more in his room, his mind a catalogue of facts, contradictions and fragments, the torn diary, the missing glove, the extract vial, the journal entry, the witness, the ribbon, the will. He thought of Clarissa Wynter, poised, theatrical, and above all, perceptive. She had seen something, or someone. And like any great actress sensing the final act, she had written her cue for Poirot in the only language he understood, subtlety and fear. At sunrise he stood beneath the fig tree once more. Mist curled low around the ground, and the earth was damp with dew. The bench still bore the imprint of her absence. He closed his eyes. He could almost hear her voice. When the curtain falls, don't trust the applause. Tomorrow, he would raise the curtain one last time. And when it dropped, someone's truth would lie beneath it. Chapter 7. The grey cells stir. The following morning broke cold and pale, the mist over Bramble Cottage as fine and still as lacework. A robin chirped in the hawthorn hedge as Hercule Poirot stepped into the garden precisely at 9 o'clock. His gloves were neatly buttoned, his moustache immaculate, and in one hand he carried a small cane, not for support, but for emphasis. One by one, the remaining house guests joined him. Eleanor Voss arrived first, her arms folded tightly against her coat, expression unreadable. Julian Roque followed, hands thrust into his pockets, his scarf knotted too casually. Marianne Wynter stood back from the group, watching the fig tree with tired eyes. Dr. Basil Trout trailed last, blinking against the brightness and mumbling about his ruined morning routine. Poirot regarded them silently for a moment, letting the weight of the garden settle around them. "Mes amis," he said at last, "thank you. I appreciate your indulgence in what may seem to some a rather eccentric ritual, but allow me to explain." He tapped the ground lightly with his cane. Clarissa Wynter died here. Not by misadventure, not by fate. She was murdered. There was a ripple of breath, a sharp glance exchanged between Eleanor and Julian, and a muttered oath from Dr. Trent. Poirot continued calmly. Clarissa was lured back into this garden late at night, under pretense or perhaps habit. She drank something that contained a toxic extract, a substance which mimics natural heart failure. I have found the vial, the trace on the ribbon, the missing pages from her journal. He paused, letting the silence deepen. But the method, however clever, is nothing beside the motive and the reaction. He stepped closer to the fig tree. I ask you now to recall where you were on that final evening. Walk to where you last spoke with her. Recreate your movements. Nothing theatrical, just memory. They hesitated. Eleanor moved first, stepping to the far side of the garden path. "I was by the kitchen door," she said. "I saw her walking down this way, but I left her there. I went inside." Julian wandered to the bench. "I came out for air. We spoke, briefly." "And you returned through the side door?" Poirot asked gently. Julian nodded, though a flicker of something passed behind his eyes. Marianne stood quite still. "I was inside," she said. "Upstairs. I didn't come down." Poirot said nothing. He merely turned and pointed with his cane toward a small space beneath the fig tree. And here, Clarissa was seen standing alone shortly before midnight, watching, perhaps listening. Perhaps she met someone here. Perhaps she suspected. He took a step toward the house. "I'm going to ask one final thing." He produced from his coat a folded white glove, faintly discolored at the fingertips. This glove was found wedged between the garden wall and the compost bin, the match to one Clarissa wore that evening. Someone took it, hid it, discarded it, perhaps because it had touched something it ought not to have. Poirot looked to Julian. "Do you recognize it, monsieur?" Julian flushed. "Of course not. Why would I?" Poirot turned to Eleanor. "And you, mademoiselle?" Her hands were clenched. She owned many gloves. Poirot nodded slowly. "Indeed." Then, without warning, he held up a second object, the vial, now sealed in a glass tube. At once, Eleanor's head jerked toward it, but so did Dr. Trent's. Poirot's gaze shifted between them. "Curious," he murmured. "You both seem to recognize this, and yet neither has been accused." Dr. Trent took a shaky breath. I warned her. I told her not to handle that plant." "You did," said Poirot softly. "But perhaps someone else did not heed that warning." He turned abruptly. "And now, one final demonstration." He motioned to a small tray that had been prepared earlier, hidden behind the tree. He lifted a teacup, delicate, floral, unmistakably Clarissa's. On the final evening, this was the cup from which she drank. It is not the same cup, of course, but the same make. Someone served her tea, someone placed something in it, someone walked back inside and pretended nothing had changed. He turned and held the cup toward each of them. No one moved. And then Eleanor Voss stepped forward and reached out. "Let me take that," she said. "You shouldn't be carrying—" "Ah," Poirot said, stopping her hand just before it reached the handle. "No need, mademoiselle." The hesitation in her movement, the slight tremor in her hand, the way her fingers had instinctively grasped at the porcelain, these were not the actions of someone detached from the scene. Poirot bowed slightly. "You have been most revealing." She drew back, face pale but expression still carefully blank. "I don't know what you're insinuating," she said stiffly. "Nor do I intend to say more. Not today." He looked at the others. "That is all. Thank you for your cooperation." Julian let out a laugh. "That's it? That's your great reveal?" "Not yet," said Poirot. "The final act deserves its own performance. Tomorrow, in the drawing room." Later that evening, Poirot sat in Clarissa's study once more, the music box on the desk, her hidden letter beside him. The shadows in the room were long, but his thoughts were sharper than ever. He knew now how the murder had unfolded, the extract, the ribbon, the glove, the timing, the false statements, the sudden composure. It was no longer a matter of who had done it. It was only a matter of when he would reveal the how and the why. The little grey cells had stirred, and now they whispered. Chapter 8. The final leaf falls. The drawing room of Bramble Cottage was still and solemn, as though holding its breath. Morning light filtered through the high windows, catching on the glass of Clarissa Wynter's framed portraits and the sheen of the grand piano she had once played. At precisely 10 o'clock, Hercule Poirot entered. He was dressed immaculately, a pale grey suit with a black tie, and carried nothing but a folded handkerchief. Behind him, the fire crackled softly, a final curtain waiting to fall. The guests were already assembled. Eleanor Voss, seated nearest the fire, her hands composed in her lap, her face unreadable. Marianne Wynter, leaning against the armrest, her expression mixed with apprehension and curiosity. Julian Roke, legs crossed, one hand toying with his cufflink. Dr. Basil Trent, standing awkwardly by the bookcase, clutching a cup of lukewarm tea. Poirot cleared his throat gently. "Mesdames et messieurs," he said, "we are gathered not in mourning, but in pursuit of truth. Clarissa Wynter, actress, hostess, and, I dare say, a woman of remarkable intuition, died here in her home 3 nights ago. It was, as declared by Dr. Willow's, heart failure, but it was not natural." He paced slowly across the rug. "She was poisoned with a tincture derived from Tigridia aurantiaca, a rare plant introduced to this very garden by our esteemed Dr. Trent, a cunning choice, as it mimics natural causes, but I am grateful to the doctor for having so thoroughly educated us on its properties." Trent looked up, startled. "Now see here!" Poirot held up a hand. "I do not accuse you, monsieur. You provided the means, yes, but not the motive." He turned to the others. "The motive, you see, lies not in botany, but in inheritance." There was a rustle as Eleanor shifted in her chair. "Madame Wynter recently amended her will," Poirot continued. "She planned to leave her estate to a dramatic conservatory, removing a certain someone who had expected, perhaps demanded, to inherit everything." His gaze fell on Eleanor. "You, Mademoiselle Voss, had long been her closest companion. You managed her correspondence, her medicines, her visitors. You were her gatekeeper. But when Clarissa decided to sever that dependency and name others in her place, your position, your livelihood, even your sense of identity, was threatened." Eleanor's lips parted. "She changed the will. I knew, but I didn't." "You did," Poirot said gently, but firmly. "You brewed the tea she drank that night. You infused it with the extract, placed the cup near the window, and returned inside. You removed pages from her journal that might name you. You took one of her gloves, perhaps to handle the vial, and discarded it near the garden wall. You buried the journal Clarissa carried that night, but not well enough, and you overlooked a ribbon, smeared with pollen, that betrayed your gloves. The final clue, however, was not one of science." He stepped closer. "It was psychological." Eleanor tensed. "You see," Poirot said softly, "during the reenactment I showed you Clarissa's cup, not the actual one, of course, but a duplicate. You reached for it instinctively, protectively, just as you must have done the night you placed it on the bench." She stared at him, pale. Poirot turned away. Clarissa was no fool. She sensed danger. She wrote to me, though she could not name her enemy. Her final days were filled with unease because she realized too late that love given freely can become a weapon when bound by resentment. Eleanor stood abruptly. "You think you understand?" she said sharply. "She kept me here for years, dependent, on her terms. She'd humiliate me in front of guests, dismiss me with a gesture, and then beg me never to leave. And I stayed. I devoted my life to her." Marianne's voice broke the silence. "And then you took it." Eleanor's shoulders sagged. "I didn't plan it. I found the extract by chance. Trent had left notes in the conservatory. I just knew how to do it." Poirot stepped forward and gently removed a white handkerchief from his pocket, dabbing at his lips. "The constable waits outside," he said quietly. Eleanor's face stiffened. She turned, walked to the door, paused, and for a fleeting moment she looked not guilty but deeply tired. The door shut behind her with a click. The silence that followed was profound. Dr. Trent cleared his throat. "Well, I shall need to speak with the constable. For the record, I had no idea." Poirot waved him off. "Rest easy, Doctor. Your knowledge was misused, not offered." Marianne looked at Poirot. "Did you know, from the beginning?" "From the moment I saw Clarissa's shoes," Poirot said. "They were damp, but there had been no rain. She had gone into the garden, of her own accord, but not alone, and not safely." Julian stood. "What now?" Poirot smiled faintly. "Now, monsieur, life resumes, and perhaps for some, in better measure than before." He turned toward the hearth, where Clarissa's portrait gazed down upon them, feathers in her hair, eyes alive with stagecraft. "She gave the performance of a lifetime," Poirot said softly. "And even in death, she cued her audience perfectly." He paused, brushing a speck from his cuff. "And now, mes amis, if no one objects, I shall take the noon train to London. The countryside is charming, but the city, it calls." As the train pulled out of Marlingford, Poirot sat in a first-class carriage, his hat placed neatly beside him, and his thoughts already shifting to the next puzzle. Outside, leaves danced in the wind, but one leaf had fallen, quiet and final. And it had told the truth. Epilogue. The curtain falls. A week had passed since the truth had been unveiled, and Bramble Cottage, once so full of performance and pretense, had returned to quiet. The autumn winds had gathered up the last of the golden leaves, leaving the garden bare and honest, like a stage after the audience has gone. Eleanor Voss had been taken into custody without resistance. Her final words to Poirot were not of guilt or denial, but of disappointment. She said, "I was the only one who ever saw her clearly. And yet she left me behind." Her trial would follow in time, but the village of Marlingford had already begun rewriting her role, no longer the loyal companion, but the resentful shadow behind the curtain. Dr. Basil Trent, though shaken, returned to his greenhouse and resumed his correspondence with botanical journals. He spoke little of the murder, preferring the silent company of roots and petals to that of people. Privately, Poirot suspected that Trent's guilt lay not in deed, but in knowledge left too easily accessible. Julian Roque disappeared the morning after Poirot's final gathering, leaving behind an unfinished notebook, a crumpled theatre programme, and a train receipt to London. Rumour had it he was seen near Shaftesbury Avenue, still chasing the stage life he so often imitated. Marianne Wynter remained behind a few days longer, tending quietly to her aunt's affairs. She walked the garden every morning, often stopping beneath the fig tree, not in grief, Poirot thought, but in recognition. She had loved Clarissa in her own thorny way, and now she seemed determined to preserve something of her legacy, not the drama but the clarity that came with age. Poirot stayed for one final night. He had no desire to rush. There was something about the house, its silences, its memories, that asked for respect. In the drawing-room he sat beside the fire, sipping a modest tisane and watching the shadows dance across the carpet. Clarissa's portrait still hung above the hearth, regal, amused, unbothered, Poirot looked up at it and allowed himself a faint smile. "You gave your final performance with conviction, madame," he said softly, "and you left the stage on cue." He thought back to the clues, the torn journal pages, the misplaced glove, the silent reenactment. But most of all, he thought of Clarissa's hidden letter. She had not named her killer. She had not even tried. Instead, she had trusted the person she once called the most infuriating little man in Europe to do what he always did: observe, interpret, and restore order. It was a curious thing, Poirot mused, not justice exactly, but balance. Clarissa had lived a life of imbalance, adored by many, truly known by few. In death, she had given her truth to the one person she believed would listen. And he had. The next morning, Poirot boarded the 10:12 to London from the tiny Marlingford station. The air was sharp, the train compartment warm. As the engine pulled away, he allowed himself a rare indulgence, a look back. Through the window, Bramble Cottage was just visible in the distance, nestled among skeletal trees and patches of frost-bitten ivy. A single curl of smoke drifted from the chimney. The house no longer felt watchful. It felt at rest. He turned away and opened a small envelope Marianne had pressed into his hand before he departed. "For your kindness and your clarity." Inside was a folded sheet of Clarissa's writing paper. Upon it, in her unmistakable hand, was a single line: "When the applause fades, the truth remains." Poirot smiled. He folded the note and tucked it inside his breast pocket, close to the heart. Somewhere in Kent a leaf falls, and the wind this time says nothing.